Alright, hello Amlet guys. I'm recording this video so that it can help you with your understanding of Scarlet Letter, especially chapters 1 through 5. And for those of you guys who found it a little bit difficult, I know Nathaniel Hawthorne writes in kind of an older, antiquated style, and we might not be used to it. So hopefully this video kind of helps you understand a little bit more of what he's saying as we read. And I'll have my book along with you, and I have a couple visuals to help you as well. And I'm not opposed to you guys reading over things like SparkNotes or Schmoop or other websites that help you understanding the content of the book, as long as you're also reading the book. Okay, because if you're just reading SparkNotes and Cliff Notes and those other literary aids, it's not going to give you the full picture of what we're looking for in terms of the story itself. Okay, so please read the book as well. So let's start. Chapter 1. Let's do this. Chapter 1, Hawthorne gives us a picture of the Puritan world, and we talked about this in class already, but the Puritan world had a lot of ties with their religion and the way they governed. So it's almost like a theocracy where they looked at the Bible, they looked at Christianity, and they let the teachings of the Bible impact the way they did government and how they implemented laws. And so there was a lot of judgment, there was a lot of punishment, and that's why there's these themes of guilt and shame and judgment that will occur throughout this book. So keep that in mind. Remember those themes: guilt, shame, judgment. Okay? And we see that with Hester Prynne in the beginning. But we also see that with the way that they created their society even. Remember the first two things that they built, according to chapter 1, were a cemetery and a prison. And you kind of see how they valued law and order, and that they saw the depravity of humanity, and knew that we were all destined to die. And so that's why they built those things. And also with the prison door, remember how it was described in chapter 1? It's big, it's old, it's rusty, it's marked with weather stains, beetle browed and gloomy. There's these weeds around it, it's rusty, iron spikes. And so I thought this picture down here on the bottom right did a good job representing that and showing how ugly this door looked that kept the prisoners in. But next to it, this juxtaposition, remember I said that Hawthorne likes to do that a lot. There's this juxtaposition of this ugly door with this beautiful rose bush, and it's described as delicate gems, offer fragrance and fragile beauty. It's just this beautiful looking rose bush, right? And we're introduced to Anne Hutchinson, whose picture is actually on the next slide, so I'll go there. So on the left over there, that's actually a picture of Anne Hutchinson, who's being excommunicated from the church because she stood up to some of the church teachings, and she was actually a church leader. And at that time in Puritan society, women weren't allowed to be leaders, and so she got excommunicated. But it's interesting here because in chapter 1, it says that potentially this rose bush came out from Anne Hutchinson and when she left the prison. And so he's doing this allusion. He's alluding to Anne Hutchinson. If you remember from your literary terms, an allusion is a reference to some historical figure or other literary work. And so Anne Hutchinson is being alluded to here because there's going to be a lot of parallels between her and our main character, Hester Prynne. Okay, so keep that in mind, Anne Hutchinson. And then in chapter 2, the marketplace, again, this juxtaposition that we see between the women of the town, who are these kind of ugly, masculine, judgmental, iron faced, gloomy, pale, very ugly looking women who are incredibly judgmental to Hester. Remember, they say things like, at least she should have gotten the brand of hot iron on her forehead, remember? Or she should have died. They said if we were in charge of the judgment, she would have been dead, so that it wouldn't allow anyone else to be led astray. And that's juxtaposed with Hester Prynne herself, who's described as this figure of perfect elegance, right? Abundant hair. She's beautiful, regularity of feature and richness of complexion, ladylike, feminine gentility, indescribable grace, right? Ladylike again, beauty. And so there's this juxtaposition between the women of the town who are very judgmental and Hester Prynne, who ironically had committed the crime. But in another instance of irony, the symbol of shame that's supposed to be on her badge, and you can see that from the middle picture here, is this beautiful embroidery A. And she's the one who embroidered the A, and it's just this beautiful work of craftsmanship. And it's juxtaposed with the ugliness of her sin and what that's supposed to represent. And so Hawthorne is trying to show us that the people who are judging are actually the ugly ones, and Hester, who actually committed the sin and is taking the punishment, she's actually the more beautiful one. And then later on in chapter 2, she's also described as this kind of like divine, um, Madonna-ish, and Madonna is supposed to be the Virgin Mary. And so there's like that picture on the bottom. I love that picture. It's on some of the covers of some of your books. Um, it has this divine quality about her. I mean, if you look at her, it almost looks like Mary holding baby Jesus, right? And so he's trying to draw that image of Mary holding the baby to show that Hester kind of has that divine quality, right? Even though she had committed a sin. And she faces the scaffold, which, if you see later on in chapter 2, is supposed to be this pillar of shame. She faces her punishment with courage and with confidence, and she emerges victorious, right? But chapter 2 does end with her recognizing somebody in the crowd, or she's drawn to somebody in the crowd. And in chapter 3, it further explains who that person is. She sees this ugly looking person, a figure um, who's described as slightly deformed with the left shoulder a trifle higher than the right, a man well stricken in years, so he's old, he's ugly. And so remember, keep that in mind how Hawthorne describes people and their outward appearance often reveals what's inside. That's another theme that we'll continue developing. So this man, he's ugly, he's new in town. He had originally been captured by Native Americans. He was shipwrecked, and now he's just coming into town and he's not understanding what's happening. And he's like, "Who's this person on the scaffold?" And the townspeople are like, "Are you dumb? It's Hester Prynne. She got caught with a baby. She had, she got pregnant out of wedlock, and so she's getting shamed." And so she's not, and also we find that she's not divulging, she's not explaining who the father is. And so this weird deformed man, he's like, I wonder who it is. And we'll later find out that this deformed man was actually Hester's husband, who Hester had presumed dead because he was supposed to have come years ago into the new world after she was sent on her own. But Hester, this young, beautiful woman who's still very young, married this old, deformed Roger Chillingworth, and thought he was dead, and so that's why she kind of had this affair. And so later on in chapter 3, we see the magistrates like Governor Bellingham, John Winthrop, and Mr. Wilson, or John Wilson, I'm sorry, who are questioning Hester and trying to get her to share who's the father. Who's the father, Hester? Right? And then we have also Dimsdale, who was Hester's reverend at the time, who's like this sickly man, but he's also described as a very revered person in town, but he's appearing sickly and he's appearing nervous and not as confident as he usually is. And they want him to ask Hester who's the father, but she will not. She will never. And towards the end of chapter 3, it said, Dimsdale ends, "She will not speak. Wondrous strength and generosity of women's heart, she will not speak." So he's praising her for not giving into the judgment and punishment that the other magistrates like Governor Bellingham and John Wilson are trying to pressure into. And so that's how chapter 3 ends. And we'll move on to chapter 4. All right, so chapter 4 is titled The Interview, and it's the interview between Roger Chillingworth and Hester Prynne. Of course, Roger Chillingworth is not his name. He is creating a fake name so that people won't know who he is in town. And so he's trying to figure out who the father is, because we find out in this chapter that he actually is Hester's husband, who was presumed dead. So the tides have turned, the twist has occurred. And so we learn more about his journey and how he has learned a lot of different skills in medicine, having, been captured by the Native Americans for so many years. He has all these different types of skills in science and medicine. And so they have this very, very intimate and kind of sad conversation where he's like, I know I'm this old man and I'm ugly, I'm deformed, but you're this young, beautiful woman, so it's almost my fault that you committed this sin. But she also says, I have greatly wronged thee, and then he answers, we have wronged each other. And what he right here at the end, or in the middle of chapter 4, it says, mine was the first wrong when I betrayed thy budding youth into a false and unnatural relation with my decay. Therefore, as a man who has not thought and philosophized in vain, I seek no vengeance, plot no evil against thee. Between thee and me, the scale hangs fairly balanced. But, Hester, and here's the rub, the man lives who has wronged us both. Who is he? And so we get introduced to another theme that Hawthorne is presenting with us, and that's revenge. So in the previous chapter, we saw the themes of guilt, shame, punishment. We also saw the theme of your physical appearance revealing what's inside. And now we're seeing this theme of revenge. And Chillingworth, he's gonna be on this journey that's hell bent on getting revenge on the father of Hester's baby. All right, but Hester has decided that he's gonna keep a secret, and Chillingworth is like, not thy soul, no, not thine. I'm gonna get it. And so, as the story progresses, you'll see how that revenge eats at his heart. Okay. In chapter 5, the last chapter that you're supposed to have read, is titled Hester at Her Needle. And it's basically kind of fast forwarding a little bit after Hester has received her punishment. She kind of moves on the outskirts of town. She, interestingly, doesn't leave town. She stays by, even though she totally could have. But she decides to stay by in this very humble cottage, and she's described as very kind of dull. She wears very drab clothing, and the only thing that is of color when what she wears is her Scarlet Letter, right? And interestingly, though, what she decides to take up is embroidering or needlework, which is, making clothes. And so, a few pages into chapter 5, we see that she starts to make clothing for her infant first and then for the townspeople. And interestingly, it says, by degrees, nor very slowly, her handiwork became what would now be termed the fashion. Because in the previous paragraph talks about how she was, making collars for people, deep ruffs, painfully wrought bands, and gorgeously embroidered gloves were all deemed necessary to the official state of men assuming the reins of power. And so she was making clothing for the people who had judged her. If that's not irony, I don't know what is. And so Hawthorne's using this irony because she has kind of overcome her sin and punishment, and now she's giving back to society. She's making clothing, and this is beautiful clothing juxtaposed. Remember this idea of juxtaposed to the dull clothing that she's wearing. And also the clothing that she makes for Pearl, her daughter, is this beautiful, fanciful, fantastic ingenuity. So it's this beautifully ornate, embellished, embroidered clothing for Pearl, and that's why I chose this bottom picture on the right, where you see Hester wearing this kind of drab clothing, but Pearl's wearing this beautiful, colorful clothing. And so, very interestingly, as Hester continues, we see kind of a moral change develop in her heart as well. And the people still continue to see her as lowly, as you continue to see dames of elevated rank likewise, whose doors she entered in the way of her occupation, were accustomed to distill drops of bitterness into her heart, sometimes through that alchemy of quiet malice. So they're kind of giving her that cold shoulder and that haughty judgment. And what's worse, in the next paragraph here, the children are also judging Hester. It says here that she grew to have a dread of children, for they had imbibed from their parents a vague idea of something horrible in this dreary woman. So what Hawthorne is saying, that the women or the people of the town were helping the children be judgmental towards Hester as well. And that was really painful to her because the children don't know her. Children don't know what sin she committed, yet they're automatically judging her in her heart. Same with strangers who came into town and saw the letter A. And she says here that it was almost like it was branded afresh into Hester's soul. And so that shame is not leaving her. And lastly, I love how the chapter ends because as she is growing, you see the moral change in her heart because she's now having this kind of supernatural knowledge to see hidden sin in other people. The second to last paragraph says here that it gave her, meaning the Scarlet Letter, gave her a sympathetic knowledge of the hidden sin in others' hearts. And it goes on to say that as she would walk by very elevated people like the reverends or governors of the town, she would kind of have this almost spidey sense, a sixth sense tingling within her, and it would kind of give her the notion that the person who's passing by her has some kind of secret sin themselves. And so she had this sympathetic throb because she knows what it is to be wronged, to be wrong, to have sin, and to have it hidden in her heart. And so she's growing morally. And we see her, even though people are judging her, she's being elevated morally. And so that's a very interesting, almost ironic twist that Hawthorne will continue developing as we read along. So hopefully that was helpful for you as you continue reading. And yeah, I hope to continue discussing with you guys in class.